Alright, what's up everybody? Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking about the continuing Ukrainian counterattacks in the southern front, as well as a couple of the pushes that the Russians have made in the general defense strategy for some areas of the front. So I thought I'd just do a little overview. So where we left off in last video was pretty much around this kind of dotted line. The Ukrainians had taken some of it, but this was the pre-offensive line in this area kind of by Pokrovsk. On this axis, Pokrovsk has become the main settlement that the Russians have been targeting because it's the supply hub for the region and kind of the logistical base for this axis of the front by Orihyiv. This axis specifically, and more broadly, this kind of area north of Vuhledar and Velika Novosokha has been the main area that Russia has been making progress in over the past year. But as Russian communications became challenged by the loss of Starlink and the partial disabling of Telegram, the Ukrainians took advantage of this and reclaimed some of the land. Like I said earlier, the dotted line is the pre-counterattack line of control, but the Ukrainians have pushed a little bit further. On the lower half of this front, Dobropilia was the main settlement that the Ukrainians had liberated in their first one, but they've also liberated Varvarivka and pushed a little bit further into the fields in between this sort of area. Russia's main vein in this region goes along the Yanchur River, which is what they advanced along. And there were reported attacks in some of the cities even as far up as Andriivka. However, this big pocket fell into the gray zone, but as the Ukrainians have been pushing in on the sides, it's become more and more untenable to sustain attacks further in this area. Heading more to the northern region, in my last video I claimed, based on an early report, that the Ukrainians had crossed past this reservoir right here. Turns out that was correct and we just needed a little bit more time to confirm that. But it looks like the Ukrainians have confirmed liberated Vyzhneve, and it's looking more and more like Verbove has been liberated, but I think some sources still mark it as a gray zone. This is good because what I said in my last video when the front kind of looked a bit more like this, I said they should secure the flanks by either going for Kalinivske or Verbove, which there have been attacks into Kalinivske recently. And then from the north, they should meet up with the Ukrainians in the south and try to cut the Russians along this Yanchur River line. We'll see if this does end up happening because I don't believe the Ukrainians' main goal in this area is to do some sweeping, go to Crimea, whatever. The main goal is probably just to improve their positions as well as get them away from the back of Orihyiv. Like I said in my last video, this southern front by Orihyiv has been extremely static and is very well fortified on both sides. Orihyiv kind of, oops, what the hell? Oh, what am I doing? Oh, it's carving. My arrow got ED. Sorry about that. So Orihyiv pretty much acts as the gate into Zaporizhia and further through this oblast. And this area is especially flat. This definitely be using that clean and clear. There's no bumps on this at all. The geography in this region doesn't benefit Ukraine too much because there's not many rivers to hide behind and there's a lot of reverse slopes in the Russians' favor that they can use for their artillery. That's one of many reasons why it's been important to lock Orihyiv down, and they've been able to do that. And I think I heard a report a couple years ago that this is the area that has the highest troop concentration out of anywhere on the front. That's probably changed a bit by now, but that's just an example of how important this part of the front is to both people. So for those reasons, Ukraine's going to take every opportunity they get to push the Russians back further away from this flank. Moving over to that push that I missed when I created the map, this area is important to the overall battle of Orihyiv because Russia's main goal is to outflank the settlement because of how tough the fortifications are to the south of the settlement. However, this push does set them back a lot. The last video I talked about how the Ukrainians have pushed them back from Lukyanovsky about probably to that line or so, but pushing them back out of Primorsk sets them back a lot. I'll get into this a little bit more later, but Russia's main strategy now that they have much more manpower than they used to is basically to throw a bunch of people and drones in one area to create a big bulge on the front and then expand the flanks outward, taking advantage of Ukraine's manpower issues. So generally what you'll see is the Russians want these long little weird looking column tentacle things, and the Ukrainians want a smoother front line overall in general. That obviously doesn't apply 100% of the time, but that's a general way to look at it right here. So it definitely benefits the Ukrainians that they push the Russians out of Primorsk. This area is higher elevated, so the Russians could have pushed into here and then kind of rolled down this hill, taking these settlements. And then if they ended up expanding the front line to here, Orihyiv is not really looking that good. But the Ukrainians pushed them back and were able to keep this smaller kind of front line contained right here. The good thing is now Ukrainians hold the positions on the hills. Each of these contour lines, which are pretty much invisible, are about 20 meters. So they have a decent height advantage, and I'm expecting with the amount of drones they have, this little area with some of the houses is probably going to become a gray zone. So we'll see how everything advances from this area onwards. Moving on to some of the other Russian advances in the region, this one magically erased itself for some reason, but the Russians have captured the southern part of Huliapole. This was the main hub of this part of the front a couple of years ago, but as the Russians began to bypass this area after they captured Vuhledar, this is going to put pressure on the Ukrainians because there's not a whole lot of defensive geography anywhere. Honestly, there's nothing here. This is just straight shot to Orihyiv. So it's likely we're going to see some man-made fortifications and trenches being constructed along this area, along what is here. There's a couple small rivers. But I think that could be another reason why the Ukrainians are pushing into this field south of Pokrovsk to sort of put more pressure on the Russians in Huliapole. Oh, it's Huliapole? Oh, I've been saying that wrong for 3 years. So overall, this advance happened a couple days ago. We're just going to wait to see how it develops in this area because I'm not entirely sure. It depends on the fortifications that are in this region that we just can't see on the map yet because the satellite doesn't update that soon. Moving more up north, we kind of have this awkward zone between Pokrovsk and Pokrovsk that doesn't really have a name, but we'll call it Novopavlivka for now. The Russians have advanced into these two settlements by the area. I don't think the Ukrainians are too worried about this because these two settlements likely aren't supposed to be permanent fortifications. If I had to guess, I bet the main Ukrainian fortifications are behind the Vavcha River right here going across this line of settlements. Across this whole area, they have about a 40 to 60 meter height advantage, which is definitely going to be beneficial in keeping the Russians back. There's some relatively big settlements along this area too, so I'm guessing this is where the main defense line is in the area. The further north we go, we're going to see that Ukraine has a bit better geography than in the south. This area has been so easy to advance in just because of the lack of natural barriers. So overall, I wouldn't be too worried about this Malo-Mikhailovka area until the Russians pierce the Vavcha River across this area. Heading a bit further north, we got this area a bit to the west of Pokrovsk. Once again, I think the main Ukrainian fortifications are probably along the natural elevation in the area and the rivers, but this is about 4 less settlements that the Ukrainians can buy time in. Heading north of Pokrovsk, where the Russians had closed a bit of a pocket in the north of the city, they pushed a little bit north of Mirnohrad, which means the Ukrainians are probably going to have to retreat from this part as well. I'd guess that the post-Pokrovsk defense line for the Ukrainians is this rail line, which I marked along the red right here. Past this rail line, there's hardly any geographical barriers for the Ukrainians to use for defense, so it's in their best interest to keep them behind this rail line. We'll see what's going on here, but after Mirnohrad falls, it looks like the battle for Pokrovsk is probably going to end. The new axis of defense is probably going to be this rail line along Khryshine and Serhivka. I'd only panic in this region if the Russians manage to cross this rail line though. Heading over to Konstantinivka, the Russians have captured this sort of large area south of the city. Once again though, the main Ukrainian fortifications in this area are along the river and behind and using the height to their advantage in this area. There's about a 60 to 80 meter height difference between these two areas, and reducing the amount of land that the Russians have to maneuver is going to be in their best interest, which is going to help with the lakes in the area. I think Konstantinivka is going to be hard for the Russians to take without flanking, as we've seen in Bakhmut, which is a little bit bigger than Konstantinivka. The Russians have a hard time fighting in these heavily fortified urban areas. We'll see how it goes, but I think Russia's goal is still probably to flank Konstantinivka. I'm still not sure if they do want to take it head on or if they're going to try to return to their strategy in 2022 of flanking Sloviansk and Kramatorsk as well, because the Russians learned after Bakhmut that it's harder to get engaged in these massive urban battles. Sloviansk and Kramatorsk are about twice the size of Bakhmut. That's going to be even harder, and there's 2 of them too. That was their main goal back in 2022 when they invaded into Kharkiv and connected the front to Izium. Their goal was to eventually sweep up around this area and kind of like close in to make the major part of the Donetsk Oblast surrender. However, they had issues getting past Avdiivka and Toretsk and a couple areas along the front in this area, and then the Ukrainians did their counterattack in 2022, which pushed them back across the Oskil River. But we'll see what eventually happens here. It's going to be interesting to watch this battle unfold. Heading north, kind of back to Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have, I have no idea how they're still even holding this settlement, but they pushed the Russians back a little bit in Chasiv Yar, with Russian sources claiming that all reports of capturing the city fully were false. They're still holding out in this southern bit of Chasiv Yar, and the middle of the city is more of a gray zone right now. Part of the reasons why the Russians haven't been able to take Chasiv Yar is because they've had to take it head on. Russia really enjoys flanking, but to the south you have Konstantinivka, which is going to be pretty much impossible without getting engaged in an urban fight. But then to the north you also have this rail line that the Ukrainians have used as defense, and also the settlement of Minkivka, which has held out for a long time as well. Overall, this sort of area of the front has been relatively stable, except for the push into Siversk. Siversk has been relatively on the front lines for a while, but after the fall of Bilohorivka, which was Ukraine's main sort of outpost to prevent the Russians from getting a further breakthrough in this area, after that fell, the Russian pushes became harder to control. Back when the front used to look more like this or so, the area south of Dibrova right here is a massive forest, and this area has been in constant conflict. The problem for Russia was every time they tried to attack into Siversk, they'd get caught in crossfire from this forest. Bilohorivka was the main settlement that was preventing the Russians from getting a foothold into flanking this area because of the salt mines in the region. But now since Russia controls the forest, they were able to push further into Siversk. Looking more up north, they've done a couple small pushes in this area, I don't know, east and west, China, America, east of the Oskil River. The Russians' main goal in this region is Liman, which there was a battle for back in October 2022-ish. This settlement's kind of the checkpoint of where you can launch an invasion of Sloviansk from. Back when the Russians had crossed the Seversky Donetsk River, before Ukraine did their counterattack, they were able to shell Sloviansk, which was messing up Ukrainian logistics. But I think the Ukrainians are going to try to defend Liman and Yampil with pretty much all they have to prevent that from happening again. I think the Ukrainians are going to try to contain the Russians in this area around the Seversky Donetsk River. And if things get bad in this north area, I think they'd be fine retreating to the Oskil River enough. But I think if they do that, they'd try to stall at least until the spring so the rivers aren't frozen, so they're easier to cross for the Russians. Ideally, keep keeping this Borova Le Mans sector of the front as strong as possible is in their best interest, so the Russians can't flank past Sloviansk. I can tell you after Bakhmut, the Russians do not want to get involved in another big urban campaign, so pushing through this way and heading past Kostiantynivka to go behind them looks a lot more favorable than Bakhmut times 6, pretty much. We'll see how this plays out, because this has basically been the Russians' main objective since the start of the invasion, at least in like July 2022. But I believe that's it. I think that's all the updates we have. I hope you appreciated the more in-depth coverage of the defense lines and everything. I think that's all I have for you guys, so I'll see you later. Have a great day. Today I'm going to talk about the continuing Ukrainian counterattacks. Good lord. Heading up north, the Russians captured a large part of Pokrovsk earlier. What happened to my map, bro? Yo, stop deleting my fucking line. What's wrong with